My name is Joey von Nessen. I am a research economist, but I think the basic description of what I really do is I like to call myself a so what economist. A so what economist. We evaluate the data, we show you what the economic conditions look like in the state, and then we answer the question, so what? So what does that mean to you? How does that help you? How can you be proactive in your business and take advantage of what you're seeing with the data, with what the economic conditions are showing to you? And that's what we do at Resch Marketing. I want to start out with some good news today. Charleston is ranked number 9. Not number 9 regionally, not number 9 in the state, but number 9 in the country in terms of post-recession growth, in terms of cities that have done the best in 2012. It's ranked number 9 as a top-performing city according to Milliken in the United States in 2012. This is very good news for the Charleston market. Why? Why is it ranked so highly? Well, there are 3 specific points. Number 1, Charleston's ranked high in terms of employment growth. Number 2, it's ranked high in terms of wage growth, and these are the two biggest, the two best indicators we have for evaluating a local region in terms of its economic health. It's job growth and wage growth that are associated with those jobs. And then finally, high-tech GDP growth. And that simply refers to your gross regional product, how much of your output is composed of the high-tech industry, essentially of brain activity. We have a large concentration of brains here in Charleston, and firms and companies and industries that specialize in the high-tech field. For example, you have SPAWAR here with a high concentration of engineers. You have Boeing and its associated suppliers, aircraft manufacturing requiring advanced degrees to do a lot of that strategic work. You have the medical university, again, a lot of advanced degree work there. And when we're talking about economic development, the keys to success are brain power, the knowledge economy, because when you have a large concentration of highly talented workers in an area, they go out, they innovate, and then they commercialize those new ideas. And that's how you get economic development. And the second most important is natural resources. Natural resources are critically important. And as we all know, we have plenty of those here in Charleston as well. In case you're curious, the others in the top 10, Charleston's number 9. And I hope you can see that when you look at these other cities, that you'll recognize that the knowledge economy, brain power, and also natural resources is what's the major contributor to each of these cities that are ranked in the top 10 in terms of growth, top performing cities in 2012. And then just to drive this home, I want to give you a map. Hopefully you can see this in the back, but this is the United States. This is a photo taken by NASA at night of the United States. And you can see the bright spots that reflect the thriving cities in the U.S. And one I wanted to point out to you is the one I've circled here in the Midwest, hopefully in the northern part of the country there. And this bright spot was actually not there 3 years ago. Can anybody tell me what that area is? North Dakota. Perfect. Perfect. North Dakota. They've got a booming oil and gas industry up there now with the fracking technology, being able to go out down into these rocks and bring up the oil and the gas. And in fact, for a while, there was so much demand up there that there were people living there, literally homeless, who were making 6-figure incomes because they couldn't put up the houses fast enough. So you can see very quickly what happens when you have a good set of natural resources and, of course, brain power as well throughout the U.S. All right, so let's take a look and see what's been going on. This is a picture of U.S. GDP growth over the last several years. This gives us our best broad picture of what's been going on, our best single indicator for economic growth at the national level. And as you can see, we've been growing steadily since 2010. This goes back to the first quarter of 2010. But growth has been up and down. There hasn't been a whole lot of consistently strong growth that we've seen. It's not unusual following a recession in a recovery period like we're in to see consecutive quarters of GDP growth in excess of 3 or even 4%. But if you look up here now, you don't see any consecutive quarters above 3%. In fact, only 2 quarters going all the way back to 2010 have exceeded 3% at all. So even though we're seeing consistent growth at the national level, it's still very mild. We still need to see more aggressive growth. And it hasn't happened. It's not in line with what we've seen in previous recovery periods. If we look at South Carolina, Again, starting with employment growth as being the single best indicator we have of the growth in the local economy. You can see that South Carolina has really tracked the U.S. average in terms of employment growth over the last several years. This goes back to January of 2011. The current average, annual average over the last year for South Carolina is 1.4% in terms of employment growth. That's down from close to 2% that we saw for the state as a whole in 2012. And the U.S. average right about 1.6%. And I want you to focus specifically on this blue line. The blue line represents South Carolina employment growth. And I'm going to compare different regions in South Carolina here to that blue line. But on each of the following graphs that you see, remember that the blue line doesn't actually change. The scale changes, so it seems to adjust a little bit. But this blue line is the same. This is always comparing to South Carolina. You can see the four of the major regions in the state, particularly Charleston, Greenville, and Columbia, in terms of job growth going back to 2011. So take a look. Let's start by looking at Charleston up in the top left corner there. You can see that Charleston, Greenville as well on the top right, but particularly Charleston has largely exceeded the state level average for employment growth, certainly for 2012, but also for 2011. You can also see that it's dropped off quite a bit in 2013. Now, it's not uniquely in Charleston where we've seen this drop-off in the growth rate. It's happened in Charleston and in Greenville and Spartanburg as well as some other areas across the state. But it's most pronounced in Charleston. Now, I think what this tells us is that right now, you all are experiencing a high level of sales volume, and I've heard that the levels in some cases, in some months, have been as high as they were back in 2007. Things are really going gangbusters in many sectors of Charleston, the Charleston housing market right now. Now, the cause of that is this major job growth that we saw in Charleston in 2012 and even going back to 2011, largely in manufacturing, but certainly overall job growth in Charleston. But what I'm here to tell you today is that we don't want to get too cocky. Don't want to get too cocky, because if this trend continues and the growth in Charleston in terms of employment is a bit milder for the remainder of the year and going into 2014, then the levels of activity we're seeing now may drop off a little bit. Again, Charleston's still growing, don't get me wrong, but we have seen some decline at the state level in terms of the rate of growth, and Charleston has been seeing that as well. If we look at Greenville, a similar trend, but again, Greenville and Charleston both largely exceeded the state average for a number of years. And I can actually put some lines in there to give you exactly what the average is. And this is expected because in the upstate and in Charleston, this is where we've seen the major manufacturing gains in South Carolina, which has been the major driver of our recovery so far. And then in Columbia and Myrtle Beach has been ticking up recently, and Columbia has been right on par with the state average overall. So if we look at two examples here of Charleston employment growth, manufacturing being the top graph there going back to 2011, so you can see it peak in 2011 and 2012 and then drop off in 2013. We haven't heard as many job announcements recently. You recall it seems like in 2012 and 2011 we're hearing them every month, every week almost, of new companies. They're still coming. But we're just not hearing those announcements quite as frequently. So as a result, we're seeing a little bit of drop-off in job creation there. Retail activity is up in Charleston, as are various IT services, information technology services. And of course, retail is more traditionally a carrier of Charleston's market activity anyway. All right, so the state as a whole, we've seen some slight slowdowns in the rate of growth, although we are still growing. Again, about 1.4% overall. But the growth rate is becoming much more consistent and less variable. And this is very positive for business confidence and for consumer confidence as well. And the way I can show you this is if we look at a graph of the South Carolina employment growth standard deviation. So that's just a fancy way of talking about changes from month to month. So when this blue line here that I've graphed is really high, it means that we're seeing major changes, either in a good or a bad direction, in month-to-month job fluctuations. So maybe we add 5,000 one month and then lose 3,000 the next month and gain 4,000 and so on. When the blue line is close to zero, when it's very small, we're talking about changes on a month-to-month scale of maybe 50 jobs. We gain 50, we lose 50, we gain 50, and so on. And so when it's low, it's a much more healthy set of economic conditions that we're seeing, and we're moving more towards a steady state, which allows business and consumer confidence to build up. And as you can see, recently, these gray lines represent the recessions going back to 1976. You can see that the high level of variance typically coincides pretty well with the high levels of variation there in job growth. And right now, we're getting back down to levels that are more consistent with a healthy economy. So, for example, if you look at the 1990s there, you can see we're right on track in terms of the current levels of month-to-month variance. If we look at employment growth by industry for the state as a whole, I've already alluded to the fact that manufacturing has been a major source of job gains for the state. But what else have we seen? And what story can we begin to tell about South Carolina and about how the economy is changing and what we can expect going forward? Well, this gives us a picture of all of the major super sectors, both in terms of the last 12 months of growth and the previous 24 months of growth. So if we want to compare what's been happening over the last year compared to what's been happening over the previous 2 years. And I'll draw your attention here to three specific industries. The one on the left that I circled is construction. So in 2012, we saw construction employment increase for the first time since 2007. For the first time since 2007. Very positive for the housing industry. In fact, we saw all variables of relevance increase in 2012 in housing for the first time since the recession ended. So 2012 was a very positive year overall for housing, and this is one element of that. Number two, if we look at the circle on the right, that's the leisure and hospitality sector. So that refers to a lot of the recreation industries that you would normally associate with in Charleston, food, accommodation services, hotels, and so on. And the fact that we've seen year-over-year gains in this industry, and not just in Charleston, but throughout the state, what does it tell us? It tells us that there's more demand for it, which means that there are people spending money on leisure activities now that weren't doing so a year ago or 2 years ago. That's incredibly important. It's incredibly important because it means one of two things. One, it means that people now have an employment position that allows them to be able to spend money. Or number two, they now have the confidence that they may not have had a year ago to spend money, even if they did have it before. They weren't spending it before, and they are spending it now. So very, very important to see growth in leisure and hospitality, because again, it points to this resumption of confidence that consumer spending is coming back in line with more normal time periods. The third in the middle there, that middle circle, refers to professional and business services. And the reason I highlight that is because you saw such a major gain over the previous 2 years, and then this drop-off. And what this alludes to, the major component of that actually comes from employment services, temporary staffing, contract labor. This is a major piece of professional and business services. So what we've been seeing over the first couple of years of the recovery is employers who were seeing demand being created in their, and they're responding to it, but they're not convinced that it's going to be long-lasting. So what do? Well, considering that labor is the major cost for most employers, you typically try to minimize that cost. So you'll hire contract laborers, you'll hire the temporary labor because you're not sure what's coming down the road. So what we can see is in 2012, that level of hiring actually peaked off and declined a little bit. And one other thing that I didn't highlight on the previous slide is that we saw more diverse employment growth in 2012 than we've seen in previous years. So if we combine that, we're seeing more employment growth across more industries in the state, less employment growth reliant on employment services, on a temporary workforce, and we're seeing leisure and hospitality come back, meaning consumers are spending more, meaning they either have the resources or the confidence or both to do so. All three paint a very good picture for South Carolina going forward. All right, let's look at the state overall. The gray counties here, this looks at employment growth over the last 3 years by county. The gray counties are omitted for this analysis simply because their populations are so small that when there are major changes there, they don't affect the state rate very much. So we excluded those. But if you look at the dark greens, those represent the highest levels of growth. This is over the last 3 years. And as you would expect, right, because we saw the employment growth before in Greenville and Charleston, you can see the upstate and the Charleston areas have the highest levels of employment growth. Again, perfectly consistent considering manufacturing and the major gains that we've seen in manufacturing over the last several years. Now, if we look at just the last 12 months, the picture changes just a little bit. So keep in mind those green counties, and then look how that compares to this picture here. actually changes a little bit. So where have we seen growth now? So if we go back to the 3-year picture, it's been Greenville, Spartanburg, Charleston, and then the York County area. A lot of that is feeding employment opportunities and growth that spills over from the Charlotte market. But if we look just over the last year, most of the growth has come, again, from that York County, Charlotte market region, from Myrtle Beach and from Hilton Head. And again, most of the job gains over the last year have transitioned from manufacturing actually to leisure and hospitality, concentrated largely in Myrtle Beach and in Hilton Head. So the climate is changing just a little bit from where we saw it 1 year ago. All right, the second piece, that's job growth. That's where we're seeing job growth in South Carolina right now. Recall the second important statistic to look at is income growth. And here, I think Charleston is far ahead of the rest of the state, and I think this is a place where we need to worry a little bit about where the rest of the state is going. So you can see here, I've highlighted Charleston in green. Charleston is the only major area of the state that has income growth that's exceeding the U.S. average right now. Everybody else is not doing quite as well. So this is important because the quantity of jobs is important, as is the quality of the jobs in terms of real wage gains. That's important for consumer spending. It's important for the economy as a whole. And this is something that Charleston is actually ahead of the game on, certainly with regard to South Carolina, but also for both the U.S. and for South Carolina. All right, so current threats. What can we expect going forward? What do you need to be on the lookout for in terms of major changes that could happen that could affect the economy? Well, there are 3 that I'll briefly go through. Number 1 is the payroll tax that we're all familiar with that was enacted on January 1st. And that's that 2% increase that we all saw, that every working American saw. And those are dollars that are now coming out of South Carolina. They're not being spent here anymore. And so that has a real effect on the economy. This is something that we estimated earlier in the year to be close to 0.5 percentage point of gross state product. That is to say, because the payroll tax was implemented, the increase was implemented, all other things being equal, we expect about 0.5 percentage point drop in gross state product due to that. We grew at about 3.5% last year, to put that into perspective. So it has a real effect. The sequester, number 2. Similarly, with the payroll tax, the sequester has the effect of moving a lot of federal dollars that would be coming to our state back out of our state. And so, again, those are dollars that are not being spent, ripple effects that aren't occurring through multiple suppliers, households that aren't spending as many dollars because they're not circulating through the economy. That has a real effect as well. That's a bit harder to quantify, but certainly there are federal agencies throughout the state that have been hit by it. And to the extent that that the decline in funding is real, then that has a real effect on the state as a whole. The third is the European recession. So I don't know how closely you all have been following that, but the European recession is now, I believe, in its 6th quarter. So it's been ongoing. Auto sales in Europe, there's an article this morning that talked about how they've been the lowest in 20 years in Europe. So Europe is really struggling right now, several of their nations. And that's a problem for us because South Carolina has one of the highest percentages in the country in terms of the manufactured exports that we send over to Europe. So about 5% of our gross state product comes from exports, manufactured exports to Europe. So that's normally a good thing, but when Europe is suffering, that means that we're suffering as well because they don't have the resources to buy our goods and services like they would in more healthy times. So it's very important to track Europe over time, and their economy has the potential to affect where we're going. All right, so now let's turn and talk about housing activity. Talk briefly at the national level, give you some local trends, and then we'll turn it over to Will to talk specifically to the Charleston market. First off is to look at U.S. household formations. This is actually a very promising slide to take a look at because it shows us that we have about a 2 million household deficit. That is to say, we've been growing during the recession period, households have been forming during the recession period at a fraction of what they were in a more normal time period. Normally it's about 1.2, 1.3% per year. I was down to about 0.5 of a percentage point during the height of the recession. And so as a result, we have this huge gap. We have all these people who are rooming together, who are living at home with mom and dad, any number of variety of living situations because they haven't been able to find jobs. And so this represents a pent-up demand for you. And so as job creation continues in South Carolina, and you're seeing a lot of this already, these folks are going out and they're buying homes. So this provides pent-up demand, and it's going to be there for a while because it takes a while for this to get sort of flushed out and get us back to a point of equilibrium. So this is very positive for the housing market, certainly from a national perspective. If we look at foreclosures, the foreclosure rate continuing to decline from a national perspective, from the state as well. This shows you inventory levels, mortgage delinquencies that are over 90 days, and those that have started as well. All of those moving in the right direction. So continuing on the path from a national perspective back to more healthy and more normal economic conditions. In South Carolina in particular, one of the problems right now that a lot of you are probably already familiar with is the fact that the availability of land is relatively low right now. And the reason for that is developers took a hit during the recession just like everybody else. And now that we're seeing market recovery, builders are going out looking for land. There's not as much available. So as a result, that's bidding these prices up, and that's being passed along or has the potential to be passed along to the consumer. So to the extent that the availability of land is a problem in the current market, that's going to have an impact on buyer patterns and might change buying patterns going forward. And that impacts us because of the relative price point distributions that could change as a result of that. All right, so let's look at South Carolina housing starts. What activity are we seeing now, and how does that compare to the recent history? This tracks South Carolina housing starts back to 2008. We can see we lost about 50% during the recession. Again, that's nothing new. We're all familiar with that. This reflects the new homebuyer tax credit from 2009 and 2010. We saw about a 30% gain in housing starts during that period. But essentially, we borrowed some of that activity from the following period in 2011 when we saw hardly any growth at all. And I can personally attest to that. My wife and I, when we first got married in 2009, were considering moving into an apartment starting out. But that tax credit option for us actually pushed us over the edge and got us to buy a house right when we got married as opposed to about a year later. So we personally were affected by that policy change, and we're one of the groups that were moved over into that 2010 period as opposed to 2011. And then finally, over the last year, we've seen growth of about 30%, which is right in line with what the tax credit showed. But the positive news here is that this is market-driven. These are market-driven changes, market-driven growth, which means it's more likely to be sustainable in the long run, which is much more positive going forward. And if we want to get some perspective on what a healthy market looks like, I think it's very useful to look at long-term trends. You know, we see data, we see all these statistics quoted on month-to-month basis. It's up, we're down, we're up, we're down. But it's very helpful to look at from a long-term perspective and look at the trend lines and see where we've been before. So this tracks South Carolina housing starts. Again, same information, but this time we're going back to 1990. And I hope you'll agree with me that the 1990s was a pretty healthy time for housing markets nationally and in South Carolina. And so we can compare the two, where we are now compared to where we were in the 1990s. And to the extent that you believe me that these yellow arrows are the same slope, and I promise they are, then what you'll see is that we're growing at about the same rate we grew in the 1990s. So we're at a much healthier point now in terms of housing growth, certainly in South Carolina, as measured against the 1990s, which was also a much healthier period. We've sort of moved away from a lot of the variations that we saw in 2009, 2010 as we're trying to sort this out. And we're finally to the point where we're getting more of a consistent picture of the market and slow and steady growth, which is really the key for a healthy market going forward. If we look at housing starts, for the last 12 months, in Charleston in particular, you can see that Charleston's dropped off a little bit relative to the state average, down to about 16% compared to close to 25% for South Carolina. Myrtle Beach really been leading the way in 2013. They've really picked up steam. They've been the market leader recently. And a lot of the reason, though, for Charleston dropping off a little bit is because of the decline in the manufacturing employment growth that I showed you earlier. If I had showed you this graph 6 months ago, Charleston would have been the market leader ranked slightly above Myrtle Beach, but now having dropped off just a little bit since then. If we look at housing sales activity also up. We can see this gives us growth levels comparing quarter-over-quarter growth going back to the first quarter of 2012. The blue represents new sales. Orange represents resale activity. So as you can see, resales are really dominating the Charleston market overall, with the exception of the fourth quarter of 2012. Now, this isn't necessarily unusual, but the extent to which the resale market is dominating in terms of growth patterns is unusual. Historically, we typically expect to see resale activity comprise about 65% or so, 63% of all sales activity, of all sales. But in 2012, it was up to 78%. Up to 78%. So only 22% of all homes sold in 2012 came from new home sales. And so that dynamic is changing. So when you're looking at competition between new home sales and resale activity, that dynamic has changed. The market is much more concentrated now than it was before the recession began. And I'll talk about that here in just a moment. First, let's move on and talk about another indicator. Let's talk about the Federal Housing Finance Agency's House Price Index. And this gives us a measure of house price appreciation in South Carolina and in the various markets. So as we can see, in the last 5 quarters, for 4 of them, we've seen growth, we've seen appreciation. So this is very good from the perspective of the consumer, particularly those who are sitting on the fence, because if they're waiting because they don't want to buy a house when it's going to depreciate, I mean, who does? We want an asset that's going to appreciate over time. Waiting for the market to bottom out, this is clear evidence that it's bottomed out. 4 out of the last 5 quarters now, we've seen appreciation in South Carolina. That's been driven by, not surprisingly, Charleston and Greenville. Charleston was the first to pick up. Greenville was the second. So the purple and the blue bars there that have turned positive, you can see are Greenville and Charleston. Columbia and Myrtle Beach haven't turned positive just yet. Myrtle Beach is still struggling a little bit. Haven't quite bottomed out, but they're moving in the right direction. But again, this goes right in line. Employment growth is what leads to housing demand, and we're seeing that, and of course that feeds over into house price appreciation. It all fits together. All the pieces come together and tell, I think, a consistent story for what's going on in the state right now. And finally, I want to point out some MLS numbers too, so we can compare the two. The FHFA gives us that sense of price appreciation or depreciation. MLS data gives us some perspective on consumer preferences. It tells us what consumers are wanting to buy, because it gives us a snapshot in time, in different time periods, of what they are buying. So we can compare the MLS and the FHFA year-over-year changes. And so what you see is the purple here represents the MLS data. So we saw consumers preferring less expensive housing consistently, except for 2010 over 2009. Why? Because they had $8,000 extra that they could spend. So that bids up the average price that they're going to spend on a house. And you see that. It goes back down in 2011 and is picked back up again in 2012. Again, this is due to market conditions, so it's a much more positive change. The FHFA, following suit with blue in 2012 there, again reflecting that we've seen some house price appreciation in the local market. Now I want to compare that same graph to Myrtle Beach, just to show you the changes and the differences. Myrtle Beach is one of the last markets that comes back because it has such a high concentration of the second homes market there. But you can see the MLS data reflect the blue bars, the FHFA reflect the red bars. So the FHFA is getting closer and closer to zero. They're almost bottomed out. But in the most recent 12-month period, we've seen MLS numbers turn positive. So even there, the prices are moving in the right direction from the perspective of the consumer. And then lastly, builders reporting at least one sale. This is something that I want to mention because this gives us an indication of how concentrated the market has become here locally and certainly throughout the state. You can see this compares the same quarter going back to 2007, and you can see how many builders have actually dropped off. This gives you a measure of the number of builders that reported at least one sale in a given quarter. Close to 180 back in 2007, just about 80 period, in the last quarter of 2012. So a sizable drop-off. So the market is much more concentrated. And in addition to that, there are very few builders that are comprising most of the sales. It turns out that the top 10 builders comprise between 70 and 80% of all the sales in the marketplace, all the new home sales in the marketplace right now, depending on the submarket region that you look at in Charleston. So it's a much more concentrated market, which means that builders have to be much more aggressive in terms of capturing market share. And as I just showed you, even though the market is growing right now, it's not growing at a rate that new demand, new activity is going to be sufficient for builders to capture additional market share. They're going to have to be more aggressive and go out and take it from other builders by positioning themselves as a competitive alternative to the competitive builders that they identify. So then just to sum up, the South Carolina economy, we're still growing, but we have slowed in 2013. Sort of the aggregate measure that we can look at there is employment growth, down from about 1.8% overall, close to 2% in 2012 to 1.4% over the last 12 months now. Consumer spending is picking up as we've seen increases in demand for the leisure and hospitality sector. That's very positive for business and consumer confidence. Housing sales activity, very strong, but again, we don't want to get too cocky, I like to say, because employment growth, if the reduction in growth that we've seen persists, then that could mean that we see a little bit of decline in the activity that we've seen so far in 2013. And then finally, new home markets, extremely concentrated. And again, going back to market share, to expand market share, it's not sufficient to get it from new demand. Builders are going to have to be very aggressive and take it from other builders to be successful.